Fellini's four most famous movies, La Strada, Le Notti di Cabiria, La Dolce Vita, and Otto e Mezzo, all end with an attempt at ascension. His characters, as a rule, go through some sort of evolution towards a higher version of themselves, and with the exception of La Dolce Vita's Marcello, they all end the movie with a newfound awareness of love and divinity. In a highly religious culture, this is not unexpected. Fellini's subversion of this expectation comes from the way that these characters evolve rather than the fact that they do alone. Each of these ascensions are led by the love of man rather than by a love of the church. These ascensions at the end of Fellini's films are often spiritual ones rather than literal bodily ones. Rarely do the characters which ascend actually die. In La Strada, Zampano, who has spent the movie being narcissistic and ignorant of the people around him, breaks down by the sea, led by the child-coded Gelsomina, shedding his solipsistic meanness. Cabiria, who has struggled throughout her film balancing her childish naivete and her jaded facade, is abandoned by a bay and is only then privy to both the unadulterated good and bad of the world. At the end of La Dolce Vita, Marcello is tempted away from the frenzy of his friends, finding the fish, and towards Paola, and Guido dies by the sea, finally able to marry his life with the lives of all the people around him. In each of these endings, the ascensions are made clear by one important factor: childhood. This is shown in two ways in each scene, both by literal children and by the sea. Fellini grew up in Rimini, by the coast, and to him it definitively represents his childhood, shown more literally in his later, more autobiographical films, but also in that the introductions of many of these children in the movies take place on the beach. Gelsomino and her little siblings, Paola, the children who save Cabiria, child Guido and his friends. Matthew 18:3 says, "Truly I tell you, until you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." In each of these endings, the characters are marked by children and the sea. They are ascending, led by children, in a location that represents Fellini's most personal memories of being a child. The other foremost aspect of these scenes that sets them up as ascensions is the failure of language and the use of diegetic music. These don't have such specific guidelines to be followed as the scenes involving children and taking place at the beach, but in these scenes, diegetic music takes priority, and dialogue is taken from the people leading the main characters. Gelsomina is only recognizable by song.
Ah, questa.
Sì.
Ah, la cantava una ragazza che è stata qui molto tempo fa.
Paola's voice is stolen by the wind.
Non capisco, non si sente.
And Cabiria and Guido are both surrounded by musicians, which are led by child versions of themselves.
Buonasera.
Once we recognize these ending scenes as ascensions, Fellini's subversion of the expected route to ascension, especially in 1960s Catholic Italy, becomes vitally interesting. In the social culture, the route by which one was expected to love God and reach ascension was through the love of the church rather than through the love of man. In these films, the characters repeatedly try to ascend through the love of the church, seen most poignantly in the Knights of Cabiria church scene.
Wanda, sai, chiedo pure io la grazia alla Madonna, quella che hai detto tu.
Ma che chiedo io?
Ma come, non ti ricordi più?
E io posso chiedere se mi fa avere residenza a Pericoli.
Malcontent with her life, Cabiria goes and prays to the Madonna to change. This is one of the few places in the film where we see Cabiria show her vulnerability. We watch the facade that Cabiria fights so hard to retain drop, and she begs the church to help her change her life. She figures out the fallacy of love through the church in the next scene.
Non siamo cambiate. Non siamo cambiate, nessuna va! Siamo rimaste tutte come prima, come storpio.
The pitfalls of love filtered through the church are mirrored in other films, with the frenzy over the tree resulting in a boy being stampeded, Guido's first love being condemned and called the literal devil by the church.
Vergognati, vergognati, vergognati. È un peccato mortale. Non ci credo, non è possibile, non ci credo, non è possibile, non ci credo.
And Gelsomini's hedonistic, childish attachment to things being scorned by the nunnery. These scenes all have their distinctly human parallels. Kabiria's vulnerability with the giver being met with love and acceptance. This scene was condemned by the church for its depiction of philanthropy being performed outside of the church.
Come ti chiami?
Maria Ceccarelli.
Sei sola?
Mio padre e mia madre sono morti quando ero ragazzina. Io sono venuta a Roma dopo.
Beh, adesso vai a dormire, poverina.
Allora io...
Arrivederci. Cosa c'è, dimmi?
Grazie. Grazie di tutto.
The purity and slowness of Paola's introductory scene, Saragina is Guido's first love, and the fool's speech about every rock being meaningful and giving Gelsomina his necklace is a goodbye gift. The other side of this image of love through the church versus love through man is the definition between sacred and profane love. The main characters of each of these films are lovers, fundamentally. They are changed and shaped by their environments and experiences, but each of them are in some way childishly passionate and loving of life. This faces condemnation by the church figures in the films. In the Noti di Cabiria, a priest tells Cabiria that the only way to be in God's favor is by marrying and having children.
Non ne avrai avuto bisogno. Sei sposata. Male, le ragazze si devono sposare e mettere al mondo dei figliuoli.
In direct opposition to the giver, reaching God's favor by loving people out of wedlock. In Otto e Mezzo, a papal figure tells Guido, who is a stand-in for Fellini,
Voi mescolate con troppa disinvoltura l'amor sacro e l'amor profano, non è così?
but love, in and of itself, is divine. The characters in Fellini's movies are permitted to ascend simply because they're lovers, not because they direct their love where the church tells them to. Fellini puts a tangible love over a love devoted to something that cannot love back. He has his definitions of sacred and profane love, but they're distinct from the church's definitions. Fellini shows through his endings that Ascension, the way to love God and receive love in return, is through loving people.
Brava. Cogliere I fiori denota un animo gentile. Signorina, posso sperare di vederla ancora? Ah, grazie.
Zampano is led by his love for Gelsomina, Cabiria is led by the musicians, and Guido is led by the parade of all of the people in his life. Marcello is an exception. He fails to ascend. He fails to be led by Paola to the other side of the river. He turns back to the Leviathan, which presents a kind of bastardization of the love that Paola offers. It is interesting, enthralling in a gory way, but it is nothing like the purity, the angelic love that Paola holds. The love that she has is sacred and profane, human and angelic, impure and religious, and it's love where the Leviathan offers somewhere to channel interest and time, but will never reciprocate the way a person can. In religious theory, the sea returns. It represents both the depth of God's love and the depth of temptation, of sin. These ascensions take place beside the sea because they hold a dichotomy. They present the wrong kind of love as divine, but they present it as love nonetheless. The sea holds at the same time profane and sacred love. Holding them is indistinguishable, just as Fellini says they are.